This is a tale of a young girl named Amara, whose words often leapt faster than her thoughts. Her tongue, sharp and quick, nearly burned the very bridge her future would depend on. Welcome to my channel, where real, interesting, and touching African folktales come to life. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications bell so that you don't miss a thing. Anytime I drop interesting tales you get notified. Also tell us where you're watching from. The old woman's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the heap of red pepper. Though her wrapper was plain and her slippers a bit worn, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, a grace that even the harsh sun pressing down on the market could not dim. She looked at the price Amara had told her, 50 naira for the small heap, 100 for the big, and shook her head slowly. In my time, she said, her voice soft but clear, this much pepper was 20 naira. Amara laughed before she could stop herself. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. The sound was sharp enough to attract other market sellers and buyers' attention. Mama, in your time people still used cowries. Should I sell it to you for shells instead of money? A few market women glanced over from their stalls. Mama Ejiro, who sold yam, froze with her knife in the air. The banter of the market softened as people tuned their ears to this exchange. The old woman did not flinch. She only studied Amara's face for a moment, as though she was memorizing it. Times change, but kindness should not, she said. A seller can lower her price for an old woman. Amara wiped sweat from her forehead and picked up a heap of pepper, her eyes never leaving the woman. Mama, with all respect, I know your type. You have children in the city sending you money, yet you come here to price things like you are suffering. If you can't afford it, go and plant pepper yourself. Old age is not an excuse to beg. The silence that followed was heavy enough to hear a fly land on a calabash. Somewhere in the corner of the market, a baby began to cry. The old woman stared at Amara with eyes that carried neither anger nor shame, only something deeper, something Amara could not name. May your tongue not be the stone that blocks your own path, she said quietly. She placed 50 naira on the mat, took the smaller heap of pepper, and walked away with slow, steady steps. The murmurs began before she had even disappeared from sight. Amara, you went too far, one trader whispered. Do you even know who that is? Asked another. Amara dusted her hands and turned back to arranging her vegetables. An old woman with too much pride. That's all. But as the sun burned over Nkwume Market and the wind carried the smell of fried akara, the old woman's words stuck in her ears like a stubborn thorn. Amara had never been one to swallow her words. From the time she was a child, she spoke as her heart told her, unshaped by fear or caution. It was her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. Her grandmother, Mama Ifeoma, had tried to teach her otherwise. Amara, truth is like palm oil, she would say as she pounded yam with arms still strong at 70. It is good for the soup, but if you pour too much, the soup will be spoiled. Amara would laugh and shake her head. Mama, what is the use of palm oil if it is hidden in the calabash? The people must see it in the soup. Mama Ifeoma would sigh and mutter something about stubborn goats and short ropes. That evening, after the market closed, Amara returned home with her basket on her head. The path from Nkwume Market to their compound was a winding dirt track lined with cassava bushes and mango trees. Children ran past her, chasing a worn-out tire with a stick. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice rose in a song about a wandering husband. Their compound sat at the edge of the village, not far from the river. The mud walls were coated in red earth, and the roof was patched with zinc sheets that rattled in the wind. Mama Ifeoma was sitting on a wooden stool, sorting dried fish into a basin. How was the market? She asked without looking up. Fine. I sold almost everything. Her grandmother nodded, then glanced at her. And your tongue? Did it sell too? Amara frowned. Mama, you always act like I am quarreling with people. Because you are, Mama Ifeoma said. I heard from Mama Adeobi that you spoke to an old woman today in a way that made the air in the market heavy. Amara dropped her basket. So they have started gossiping already. Mama, she was pricing my pepper like she was living in the 1980s. Should I sell and make a loss? You think I am in the market for decoration? I did not say you should make a loss, Mama Ifeoma said quietly. I said you should make friends. Sometimes a customer is more than a customer. Sometimes they are a door. And a door can lead to a room filled with blessings, or a room filled with darkness. Which one do you think your words opened today? Amara said nothing. She didn't like it when her grandmother spoke in riddles. She went inside to fetch water, but the old woman's face kept floating in her mind. Not her wrinkled skin. Not her faded wrapper. But her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who saw further than the road in front of them. The next day in the market, the old woman did not appear, and Amara soon pushed the incident to the back of her mind. Life rolled on, sellers haggled, buyers complained, Goats stole from stalls when no one was looking. But every time Amara saw an elderly woman pass, she felt her chest tighten, as though she expected to see those eyes again. Her friend Ngozi often teased her about leaving the village. Amara, if you came to Lagos, you would sell tomatoes to rich people for 5 times the price. And you would find one fine man to marry you too. Amara would laugh. Me? Marry a city man? I would rather marry the river. At least the river is honest. But there were nights when she lay awake and wondered what life beyond Nkwume village looked like. She had never seen skyscrapers, never sat in an office, never worn high-heeled shoes. Her entire world was the market, the river, and the stories her grandmother told under the moonlight. One such evening, when the moon was so bright it painted silver on the mango leaves, Mama Ifeoma gathered the children of the compound for a story. Amara sat at the back, pretending not to listen, but her ears caught every word. There was once a young bird, Mama Ifeoma began, whose song was so loud and beautiful that all the other animals stopped to listen. But one day, the bird sang without looking, and her song called a hawk from far away. By the time she saw the shadow, it was too late. The hawk took her away. The children gasped. What happened to the bird, Mama? One boy asked. She learned that even the sweetest voice must know when to be quiet, Mama Ifeoma said, her eyes flicking briefly to where Amara sat. Amara looked away, annoyed. Her grandmother had a way of telling stories that felt like slaps dressed as advice. A week later, life took an unexpected turn. Ngozi came to the market with excitement bubbling from her eyes. Amara. My uncle works for a big company in Lagos. They are looking for assistants. I told him about you, how you can count money fast, how you are sharp. He says if you come, he can get you an interview. Amara's hands froze over the basket of okra she was sorting. Me? Work in an office? Why not? You are smart. And Lagos is not far. 1 bus ride and you are there. Amara laughed nervously. Ngozi, Lagos is another world. People wear suits there. I don't even own shoes without dust on them. I will lend you mine, Ngozi said quickly. Don't waste this chance. Who knows? Maybe your life will change. That night, Amara told her grandmother about the offer. Mama Ifeoma listened without interrupting, then said, opportunities are like rain. When they fall, you can drink or you can hide inside and stay thirsty. Go. But remember, the city listens more than it speaks. Watch your tongue. Amara rolled her eyes but agreed. Deep inside, her heart beat faster. She imagined herself walking in a place where buildings touched the sky, where people didn't know her name, where maybe, just maybe, she could become someone bigger. Far away, in a large mansion in Lagos, the old woman sat in a wide armchair. A young man in a crisp suit poured her tea. Mother, you traveled to the village last week. How was it? He asked. She smiled faintly and sipped her tea. Interesting. I met a young lady at the market. She does not yet know the weight of her words, but I have a feeling we will meet again. The journey to Lagos began before the sun was fully awake. Roosters were still clearing their throats when Amara tied her headscarf, hugged her grandmother, and stepped out into the cool dawn. The bus station at the edge of Nkwume was already alive, drivers shouting destinations, passengers clutching sacks of yam, plantains, and bags. Ngozi stood by a rickety green bus, waving. Amara. Come, I saved you a seat by the window. The bus groaned like an old man when the driver turned the key. Passengers squeezed in until the seats were tight with bodies and bags. A woman carrying a basket of live chicken sat behind Amara. The birds clucked indignantly as the bus jerked forward. As they left the village, the road unwound like a ribbon, first through fields of cassava and maize, then into stretches of dry land dotted with stubborn shrubs. Hours later, the trees grew fewer, the buildings taller, the air thicker with exhaust fumes. Lagos had appeared like a giant that had been sleeping and suddenly opened its eyes. The noise was the first thing that hit Amara. Horns blaring, hawkers shouting, engines rumbling. Cars moved in impatient streams, motorcycles darted between them like stubborn fish in a fast river. Welcome to Lagos, Ngozi said with a grin. Here, even the air runs. Amara's eyes were everywhere, on the glass buildings that caught the sun and threw it back, on the women in high heels walking as if they owned the road, on the huge billboards advertising perfumes, banks, and phones that cost more than her grandmother's house. The bus finally stopped near a street lined with offices. Ngozi led her into one, a tall building with glass doors that opened silently when you stepped close. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish. A man in a crisp shirt sat behind the reception desk. He gave them a quick, efficient smile. You're here for the assistant interview? Ngozi nodded and gestured at Amara. She's the one. He handed her a form and pointed toward a row of chairs. As she waited, Amara studied the people moving through the lobby. Their clothes were smooth and neat, their shoes shone like mirrors, their voices low but firm. She felt her wrapper suddenly heavy, her headscarf too bright. She tucked the loose end tighter. When her name was called, her heart jumped. A woman in a fitted navy suit led her into a smaller room. The man sitting behind the desk was young, no older than 35, but carried himself like someone who had always known how to be obeyed. His skin was the deep brown of freshly tilled soil, his suit dark, his tie neat. "You are Amara," he said, glancing at the paper in front of him. His voice was calm but had an edge like the first crack of a whip. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "You worked in a market before?" "Yes, sir. Selling vegetables." He studied her for a moment. "The market is good training. You learn to deal with all kinds of people." Amara thought she saw the shadow of a smile before he asked the next question. The interview was shorter than she expected. By the end, he nodded and said, "You'll start tomorrow. Be here at 8. My name is Mr. Ken Obi." The next day, Amara's Lagos life began. She quickly learned the rhythm of the office, the ringing phones, the tapping keyboards, the clink of teacups during the morning break. Her tasks were simple at first, sorting files, making tea, delivering messages. But she noticed that Mr. Obi watched everything, even when he seemed busy. The other assistants whispered among themselves. "He doesn't smile much," one said. "He doesn't like mistakes," another added. Amara kept her head down and worked. She was determined not to give anyone reason to think a village girl couldn't do this job. One Friday afternoon, Mr. Obi called the staff into the conference room. "My mother's birthday is next week," he said. "We'll be hosting an event here in Lagos. I want everything perfect. Amara, you will join the team handling guest arrangements." Her heart jumped. It was the first time he had given her something important. She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." As the meeting ended, she overheard two assistants chatting. "They say Madam Obi is very influential," one whispered. "Yes, and very particular about manners," the other replied. "You don't want to annoy her." Amara smiled to herself. She had dealt with plenty of customers before. How hard could one old woman be? The week leading up to the party moved like water rushing downhill. Amara found herself running errands she had never imagined, picking up delicate china plates from a store where the shopkeeper spoke through her nose, arranging fresh flowers whose names she didn't know, and confirming attendance lists with people whose voices carried authority even over the phone. Ngozi worked alongside her, sometimes teasing. "Lagos has turned you into a small madam," she laughed when she saw Amara balancing a phone in one hand and a notepad in the other. By Thursday, Amara's legs ached from moving up and down the office stairs. Still, there was a quiet excitement in her chest. This wasn't like selling vegetables in Nkwume, this felt like being part of something grand. On the morning of the celebration, the office had transformed. Tables draped in white cloth lined the hall. The smell of jollof rice and grilled chicken drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the faint perfume of roses. Amara wore a simple but well-fitted gown Ngozi had lent her, navy blue, with small silver buttons. She kept touching her hair to make sure the scarf was neatly tied at the back. Just before the guests began arriving, Mr. Obi called her aside. "My mother will be seated near the front. Make sure she has everything she needs. If she asks for water, tea, anything, you bring it quickly. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Amara said, her palms suddenly damp. Madam Obi arrived with quiet grandeur, stepping out of a black car as if the ground had been expecting her. She was small in stature but wore her Ankara wrapper with the pride of a queen. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that seemed to see past your smile and into your thoughts. "Good afternoon, Ma," Amara greeted, bowing slightly. Madam Obi gave a slow nod, then said, "You must be the new girl my son mentioned." "Yes, Ma. We'll see how you manage," she murmured, glancing toward the hall. Through the afternoon, Amara moved like a shadow, refilling water glasses, adjusting chairs, clearing plates before they could pile up. At one point, Madam Obi beckoned her. "Bring me the small plate with the puff-puff, not the big one," she said. "Yes, Ma." When Amara returned within seconds, Madam Obi's lips curved slightly. "Fast hands. I like that." By evening, the event was winding down. Laughter and music floated in the air as guests said their goodbyes. Madam Obi rose and took Amara's hand unexpectedly. "Young lady," she said, her voice firm but warm, "you work well. Keep it up, and Lagos will open its doors to you." Amara's chest swelled. At that moment, she felt as though the city had whispered a small welcome. What she didn't know was that this night would be the first step into a web of opportunities and challenges, far bigger than she imagined. The last guests were making their way toward the tall glass doors, their laughter echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged hall. The chandeliers above had dimmed slightly, their gold light now softer, like the final sigh of a long day. Waiters moved briskly, clearing half-empty glasses and plates of puff-puff crumbs, while a small jazz band played the last tune of the night in the corner. The scent of roses still lingered from the table centerpieces, mingling with the faint aroma of champagne. Amara stood near the refreshment table, her white serving gloves now slightly creased, her back aching from hours of standing. She was tired but proud. The party had been flawless. No trays had fallen, no drinks had been spilled, and every guest she'd served had smiled in appreciation. Even Madame Obi herself had caught her eye earlier, offering a small nod of approval when Amara had quickly refilled her wine glass without being asked. That nod had meant the world. Madame Obi was not just any guest, she was the mother of Ken Obi, the billionaire CEO Amara worked for. In Lagos high society, Madame Obi's name carried weight. People listened when she spoke. Her presence tonight had been a crown jewel for the event, and Amara had felt almost blessed to be serving her. But as the night stretched on, and the golden hours of the party faded into the calm after, Madame Obi lingered. She stood across the hall now, her Ankara wrapper glowing under the soft light, deep royal blue with gold accents. Her geli sat high and perfect on her head. She was speaking to a couple of elderly guests, laughing lightly, her hand brushing their shoulders in a warm, familiar way. To anyone else, she looked relaxed, gracious. But in truth, Madame Obi's mind had begun to wander. Something about that young server, that girl with the bright but cautious eyes, something tugged at her memory. At first, it was just a flicker, the way the girl tilted her head when listening. Then, the curve of her jaw. But it was the slight frown she wore when deep in thought that brought the memory rushing back. Yes. The market. That day in the village. Madame Obi could almost smell the red dust of the roadside, hear the calls of traders, tomatoes, fresh pepper, onions. She had gone to the market alone that morning while visiting her ancestral home. She liked to do so sometimes, to remind herself she was not too big for ordinary life. But that day, she had been insulted by a young lady selling pepper just because she requested she sell it for less. Now, here she was. Dressed in neat serving clothes. Her hair pulled back simply. But there was no mistaking the face, even though she almost did not recognize her initially. Madame Obi's smile to her guests never faltered, but her eyes sharpened as they followed Amara across the room. Yes. She remembered. She remembered the exact tone of the insult. The way the girl sharply responded to her. And now, fate, oh, fate was delicious, had brought the girl into her son's house. Into her son's service. She could have laughed at the irony. Madame Obi let the conversation with the elderly couple wind down, offering them her signature warm goodbye. Then she took a slow step toward the refreshment table. Each step was measured, the soft click of her heels swallowed by the thick carpet. Amara, in the meantime, had just begun stacking a tray of used plates when a cold shiver slid down her back. She didn't know why, but she felt eyes on her. Heavy eyes. She looked up, and her breath caught. Madame Obi was watching her. Not just watching, studying. Panic surged through Amara like a wave. It was sudden, deep, and undeniable. She suddenly remembered the look. It was the look of someone putting pieces together, like that of the old woman at Nkwume Market. Her hands suddenly felt clumsy. The plates clinked too loudly as she stacked them. She glanced toward the exit, wondering if she could just disappear into the kitchen. Her legs, however, seemed rooted to the floor. Maybe she's not the one. Maybe I'm just imagining it. But no, Madame Obi's eyes held that same quiet fire as they had in the market, even though her lips curved in a faint smile. Amara's heart was racing now. She bent her head slightly, pretending to fuss over the tray, hoping she would pass by without stopping. But Madame Obi did not pass. She stopped right in front of her. "Good evening, my dear," Madame Obi said softly, her voice warm but laced with something unspoken. Amara forced a smile. "Good evening, ma." Their eyes locked fully now, and Amara saw it, the moment of certainty in Madame Obi's gaze. The recognition. It was like being caught in a spotlight. Madame Obi's smile deepened, though it didn't reach her eyes. She leaned slightly, her perfume, a blend of jasmine and something spicier, wrapping around Amara like a net. "It's a small world," Madame Obi said, almost in a whisper. "Very small." Amara's throat went dry. She nodded quickly, unsure if she should speak. Madame Obi tilted her head, studying her one last time before turning away. She walked over to where her son, Ken, was speaking with the event manager. Amara watched helplessly as Madame Obi leaned close to him. She said something, too softly for Amara to hear. Ken's brows lifted slightly, his gaze flicking briefly toward her before returning to his mother. In that instant, Amara's stomach dropped. She imagined losing her job. Being sent away in disgrace. Her grandmother's old warning echoed in her head, "A careless tongue can destroy the hand that feeds you before you even taste the soup." She had thought nothing of that insult in the market. It had been just another morning, another crowded street, another stranger in her way. But now that stranger was the mother of her boss, the man whose signature kept her employed. And from the knowing look in Madame Obi's eyes, Amara felt certain, her past mistake had just come to collect its debt. When Ken finally escorted his mother toward the exit, the hall felt suddenly lighter, though Amara's chest did not. Her gloves were damp, her pulse still drumming against her ribs. She stood by the table pretending to polish a glass, but her eyes followed Madame Obi until the doors closed behind her. Outside, in the cool Lagos night, Madame Obi stepped into the back seat of her car. The driver shut the door softly, and for the first time all evening, she allowed her smile to fall away. So, she murmured to herself, removing the gelly pins one by one. The little pepper seller found herself a fine place to work. Her mind replayed the market scene in crisp detail, the girl's sharp tone, the defiance in her eyes, the way she had turned away mid-sentence as if Madame Obi's presence meant nothing. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her like that, and certainly not a young village trader. Madame Obi had let it go then, more amused than angered. But she had remembered. She smoothed her wrapper over her knees, a small hum escaping her lips. Life had a way of presenting opportunities. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Madam, home?" "Yes," she said, leaning back. "Home. Tomorrow will be interesting." That night, Amara lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The small fan in her room hummed weakly, pushing warm air over her skin. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Madame Obi's faint smile. She heard the whisper to Ken. She felt again the weight of that stare, the kind of stare that stripped you bare, peeling away all your defenses until only the truth remained. Her mind wandered back to the market. She remembered the heat that day, the flies, the bustle of bodies. She had been in a bad mood, the sun too harsh, customers too demanding. When the older woman had asked for a discount she felt was too much, Amara's words had been sharp, her patience gone. She hadn't cared who the woman was, she was just another customer. Now she knows. And the knowledge sat heavy in her chest. By midnight she gave up on sleeping and reached for her small Nokia phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found Ngozi. Ngozi answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Amara, it's past 12. Is somebody dead?" No, Amara whispered quickly. I just need to talk." She told Ngozi everything, the party, Madame Obi's approving nod at first, then the sudden change in her eyes, the whisper to Ken. She told her she was the woman she insulted back in Nkwume village market, her voice breaking at the end. For a long moment, Ngozi was silent. Then she sighed. "Amara, I don't even know what to say." "You? Insulting Madame Obi? Do you know who that woman is?" "I didn't know," Amara said quickly. "I swear, Ngozi, I didn't know. It was just, I was tired, and she wanted pepper for almost nothing. And you told her off," Ngozi finished flatly. "And this is bad, my sister. Very bad. Everyone keeps warning you about your sharp words, but you never listened." Amara pressed her palm to her eyes. "Do you think she will tell Ken to fire me?" "If she wants to, she can," Ngozi said bluntly. "She's not just his mother. She's Madame Obi. You think rich people forget small insults? No. They just store them somewhere until the day they can use them." Her words landed like stones. "So, what do I do?" "Pray," Ngozi said simply. "And work like your life depends on it. Because it just might. My uncle once told me he admired your hardworking nature, not knowing you had insulted his mother before." The next morning, Amara went to work with a forced calm. She greeted everyone warmly, moved quickly through her duties, and kept her head down. By mid-morning, Madame Obi appeared at the office. She was all smiles, dressed in a soft cream lace blouse and a wrapper the color of ripe mango. She carried a small handbag and greeted the staff like a queen visiting her court. When she reached Amara, her voice was warm. "My dear, good morning." "Good morning, Ma," Amara said, forcing a steady tone. Madame Obi's eyes held hers for a second too long before she smiled again. "You work here long?" "Almost a year, Ma." "Ah, that is good," Madame Obi said. "Loyalty is important." Then she moved on, chatting with the receptionist about her children. Amara released the breath she had been holding. Over the next few days, Madame Obi visited more often. Sometimes she would appear in the kitchen while Amara was arranging flowers, asking about her family. Other times she would pass through the lobby and watch quietly as Amara polished the reception desk. Always polite. Always smiling. But her gaze was measuring. One afternoon, she asked Amara to fetch tea from the upstairs kitchen. The request was simple, but when Amara returned, Madame Obi asked, "Did you wash the cup first?" "Yes, Ma." "Good," she said. "A person who doesn't care for small things will spoil the big ones." Each comment was wrapped in sweetness, but Amara heard the hidden testing beneath. It was as if Madame Obi was laying out invisible snares, waiting to see if she would stumble. By the end of the week, Amara's nerves were frayed. She worked harder than ever, but the fear of a sudden summons to Ken's office lingered like a shadow at her back. Madame Obi, meanwhile, observed everything with a calm patience, her mind already shaping the path ahead. The girl would learn, one way or another, that the past was never truly buried. And when the moment came, it would be in full view of everyone. The call came in the morning, just as Amara was placing fresh flowers in the vases in the reception area. The cleaner handed her the office phone with a curious look. "Mr. Ken wants to see you." "Now," the voice said, clipped and formal. Her heart gave a heavy thud. It was happening. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, replaying every word, every glance from Madame Obi. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw that faint smile, the kind that could mean forgiveness or the prelude to something worse. She had imagined all possible endings, a termination letter on the desk, her colleagues whispering as she walked out with her belongings, the shame of returning to Nkwume with nothing to show for her time in the city. Now, here was the summons. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands, checked her hair, and whispered a quick prayer that God might somehow soften their hearts. The walk to the office felt longer than usual. She passed colleagues whose greetings barely registered in her ears. She could hear her own pulse, loud and insistent, as if it wanted to drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. When she knocked and stepped inside, Mr. Ken was at his desk, his back to her, speaking quietly into his phone. Madame Obi sat by the window, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on something outside. Sunlight fell across her face, highlighting the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, lines carved not just by age but, Amara sensed, by experience. "Sit," Mr. Ken said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk once he ended the call. Amara obeyed, lowering herself slowly, as if bracing for a blow. Mr. Ken leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "My mother and I spoke about you," he began. Her fingers tightened in her lap. "She told me," he continued, "that you are courageous. You speak your mind. Sometimes too freely, perhaps, but you do not hide behind false words." Amara blinked. She had expected anything but praise. He glanced at his mother, who finally turned her eyes toward Amara. "I told my son," Madame Obi said, her voice calm but carrying weight, "that the day you spoke to me at the market, your words were sharp. But there was no malice in them. Only truth, raw and unpolished." Amara's breath caught. "Truth is rare," Madame Obi went on, "and though it stung me then, I respect it now. That is why I have asked that you work with me, closely, on a charity project in Nkwume." The words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to settle. Work with her? In Nkwume? Amara's mind scrambled to catch up. "You know the village," Madame Obi said, her gaze steady. "You know its needs. I believe your voice, once tempered with kindness, could be a bridge between those who have and those who have not." It was as if the floor had shifted under Amara's feet. She had braced for punishment, but this was something else entirely. Amara sat frozen, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Before she could speak, Madame Obi's eyes drifted to the sunlight spilling through the window, and her voice softened, not for Amara, but for the memory she was summoning. "I was not always Madame Obi," she began. "Before this house, before the cars and the parties, I was just Obi Ajili, daughter of Nwankwo the palm wine tapper. We lived in a two-room mud house at the edge of Nkwume. My hands were calloused from helping my mother pound fufu, my feet cracked from walking barefoot to the stream. I knew hunger, Amara. Not the kind that skips one meal, the kind that counts the hours to the next planting season." Her gaze returned to Amara, steady but unthreatening. "When I married into wealth, I swore I would never forget that girl. And I swore I would help the one still living the life I left behind. That is why I am going back. That is why I am taking you with me." The first days of the project were brittle. They arrived in Nkwume together, their presence drawing curious eyes. Some villagers nodded in greeting, but others merely stared, lips pressed tight. The story of Amara's sharp tongue had traveled faster than the harmattan wind. At the small community hall where the charity's work began, Madame Obi introduced Amara as her assistant. The word assistant felt foreign on Amara's skin, especially under the watchful gaze of women who remembered her as the bold girl who spoke too directly at the market. Their tasks were simple at first, sorting donated clothes, arranging chairs for the women's cooperative meetings, and visiting widows to gather lists of needs. Yet each step was laced with unspoken tension. Amara spoke little, measuring her words before they left her mouth, but her tone was still edged with formality. Madame Obi, though polite, kept her instructions precise and brief. She had a visit to Mama Ifeoma, her grandma, whose face shone bright with delight as she noticed the new change in Amara. It was when they visited a widow whose roof leaked with every rain, that something shifted. Amara had prepared to explain the charity's process in her usual brisk manner, but seeing the older woman's bent frame and the dampness on her mat, she paused. Instead, she knelt beside her and asked, "Mama, if we could fix just one thing for you this week, what would it be?" The widow smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Child, even one dry night of sleep is enough blessing." The words lingered in Amara's heart longer than she expected. Over the following weeks, small changes took root. When a mother hesitated to speak about her child's illness, Amara listened without interruption. At the cooperative, she began greeting each woman by name, sometimes adding a small joke that brought laughter. She still spoke the truth, but now it came wrapped in warmth. And the villagers noticed. The whispers that once carried her blunt reputation began to shift. She is learning. She listens now. Her words, they feel different. By the time the charity organized its first health clinic day, children ran to greet her at the hall, and women invited her to share kolanut before meetings. She was no longer just the city girl with the sharp tongue, she was becoming a bridge, just as Madame Obi had predicted. The afternoon sun was already dipping when they finished packing away the last of the clinic supplies. The hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and ripe mangoes from the baskets some women had brought as thanks. Amara wiped her brow with the edge of her wrapper, watching the last group of mothers disappear down the dusty path. The day had been long but different. Fulfilling in a way she hadn't expected. From the doorway, Madame Obi stood in her cream head tie, arms folded lightly, not as a barrier, but as if holding her thoughts close. Her eyes followed the departing villagers before settling on Amara. "They will remember today," she said, almost to herself. Not because of the medicine, but because someone made them feel seen. Her tone carried no obvious praise, yet the faint lift at the corner of her lips, the lingering glance before she turned away, spoke louder than words. As she stepped outside, Madame Obi called back over her shoulder, her voice calm and steady. "Tomorrow, we begin earlier. The work is easier when the heart is light." It wasn't an instruction, not exactly, more a quiet recognition that Amara's heart had shifted, and Madame Obi had noticed. Amara smiled to herself as she followed, the weight in her chest replaced by something softer. By the time the rains returned to Nkwume, the village no longer looked the same. Where dusty footpaths had once cut through dry earth, there now stood neat cemented walkways. The long queues women used to form at the lone, creaking well had vanished, replaced by new boreholes that gushed clear water. Market women now sold their goods under freshly built stalls, and the crumbling primary school wore a bright new coat of paint, its roof repaired against the storm clouds. It was all the fruit of the charity project Madame Obi had started, and Amara had worked on tirelessly. She had traveled back and forth between the city and the village, balancing office duties for Mr. Ken Obi with on-the-ground coordination in Nkwume. At first, some villagers had been skeptical, remembering the girl whose blunt tongue had once stung Madame Obi in the market. But as they watched her roll up her sleeves, handle complaints with patience, and greet even the most stubborn elders with respect, their opinion began to shift. Old Mama Nkechi, who once shook her head at the mention of Amara's name, now declared, "This girl has the feet of a city woman but the heart of a village child. We are lucky to have her." Through it all, Ngozi, Amara's childhood friend, was never far from the story. She was the one who had first mentioned Amara to her uncle, Mr. Obi, leading to that fateful journey to Lagos. When Ngozi returned from Lagos to Nkwume to see the project work, she walked beside her friend, Amara, grinning with pride. One evening, as they stood in front of the new market stalls, Ngozi nudged her. "Do you know what it means for me to see you like this? You were always the bold one, Amara. But now, you're bold and wise." Amara laughed softly, shaking her head. "It took a few hard lessons." Ngozi's eyes shone. "And it was worth every one of them." When the final phase of the project was completed, Madame Obi made a surprise announcement. "Amara, you've done more than I asked. I would like you to return to Lagos with me, not as a mere assistant, but as part of my family's inner circle. You have proven your loyalty." It was an offer that brought tears to Amara's eyes. In a small ceremony in the village square, she stood before the elders and publicly apologized to Madame Obi for her past words. Madame Obi, smiling warmly, drew her into an embrace. The villagers clapped and cheered, the moment sealing a chapter of reconciliation. Back in Lagos, Amara's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. Working closely with Madame Obi opened doors to business networks, training programs, and opportunities that once felt like dreams. Mr. Ken Obi, who had always admired her diligence, began to notice her in a new light. Their conversations grew longer, their laughter easier, and slowly, something unspoken began to blossom between them. Months later, under the golden lights of an elegant Lagos hall, Amara walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown. At the altar stood Ken Obi, his eyes never leaving hers. The guests watched, moved by the unlikely love story, the village girl whose words once sparked trouble now marrying the man whose family she had once offended. At her side stood Ngozi, radiant in her chief bridesmaid's dress, her smile wide enough to light the room. She squeezed Amara's hand before the vows and whispered, "From the market stalls of Nkwume to the heart of Lagos? I always knew you were meant for something great." The ceremony was grand but warm, a perfect blend of city elegance and village tradition. Mama Ifeoma came all the way from Nkwume, her eyes shining with tears as she watched her granddaughter walk down the aisle. When the vows were said and the cheers rose, Madam Obi took the microphone. "Some of you know how this young woman and I first met," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It was not peaceful." Laughter rippled through the guests. "But life has a way of humbling us, and showing us who we truly are. Amara's tongue once nearly burned a bridge, but she chose to rebuild it. And today, she walks across that bridge into a new life." The guests clapped, some wiping their eyes. Amara stood beside Ken, her heart full. After the wedding, as Madam Obi embraced her new daughter-in-law, she leaned close and said softly, "You remind me of myself when I was young, full of fire. Never lose that, but always temper it with kindness." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had learned the slow truth, that a sharp tongue could cut down or build up, and that humility was not weakness but strength. And so, the girl who once stood barefoot in the dust of Nkwume now walked confidently in the city, her story woven into the whispers of the village she came from. Under the moonlight back home, Mama Ifeoma, her grandmother, told it often. She was the girl who spoke too fast, but learned to listen, to build bridges, and to walk both roads with grace. In Nkwume, they still call her that. In Lagos, she simply answers to Amara Obi. Thanks for watching this interesting story. If you enjoyed Amara's story, kindly like and share it with others and return for more inspiring tales that guide the heart and sharpen the mind.